She was on her way to marry the man her parents approved of, but fate had other plans. When her car broke down miles from the venue, a poor mechanic with grease on his hands and kindness in his eyes offered help. And within hours, she'd walk away from everything she thought she wanted to follow the only man who made her feel truly seen. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The clouds rolled in without warning, thick and heavy, casting a strange gray over what was supposed to be the brightest day of her life. Charlotte gripped the steering wheel of her silver Mercedes with trembling hands, her diamond-studded nails clicking nervously against the leather as the engine sputtered beneath her. The dashboard lights blinked like an accusation. Engine failure, coolant low, traction control error. She swore under her breath, a sharp, panicked sound that didn't match the soft silk of the wedding dress hugging her body. She was supposed to be halfway to the estate by now, halfway to vows and champagne toasts and promises she wasn't sure she meant. The car jerked violently to the side and died in the middle of a quiet country road, flanked by thick trees and empty farmland. The silence that followed was deafening. She sat there for a moment, stunned, her breath fogging up the glass. Then came the buzzing. Her phone lit up with a dozen missed calls from her mother, her wedding planner, even the groom. She didn't answer any of them. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves scattered across the windshield like confetti made of ash. She opened the door slowly, stepping out in her heels and white gown into a world that felt suddenly unfamiliar. The cold bit at her bare arms. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She was supposed to be gliding into a courtyard filled with string lights and white roses, not standing on the side of a cracked road, mascara already smudging beneath her eyes. Her veil caught in the wind and tore from her hair, drifting like a ghost into the ditch. She didn't chase it. From across the street, a rickety garage door creaked open. It looked like it belonged in another decade. The sign was faded, the walls streaked with soot and old grease, and from the shadows emerged a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wiping his hands on a stained rag. He paused when he saw her, brow furrowing, but said nothing at first, just watched. She didn't speak either, not right away. She couldn't, not with her heart pounding like it wanted to run before she did. The wedding was falling apart, and she hadn't even decided if that was a bad thing yet. The man crossed the road slowly, as if trying not to startle her, though Charlotte couldn't have run if she wanted to. Her heels were already sinking into the gravel, the hem of her dress catching every stray pebble and dirt clump. She didn't move. She just stood there, trembling slightly from the cold, and something deeper, something she didn't have the words for yet. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady, like the kind of voice that knew how to calm chaos. Charlotte blinked at him, taking in the grease on his hands, the worn denim of his coveralls, the streak of oil that ran along his forearm like war paint. She expected sarcasm, a smirk, maybe even a leering comment about the dress. But his face stayed serious, his eyes studying her, not with judgment, but with concern. "My car just stopped," she managed, her voice cracking in the middle. "It just died." He nodded once and glanced at the vehicle. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated. Every fairy tale warning she'd ever been told flickered through her mind. Don't trust strangers. Don't go near strange buildings. Don't follow men you don't know. But something about this man, his silence, his patience, cut through the noise. She stepped aside. He crouched beside the front of the car, fingers brushing beneath the hood before popping it open. Steam hissed up in a cloud. He didn't flinch. "Coolant lines cracked. Looks like the whole system's been overheating for a while," he said, leaning in. "You're lucky it didn't blow out completely." Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, trying to suppress a shiver. "Can you fix it?" He glanced at her, then back to the engine. "Yeah, but it's going to take a while. This isn't a 10-minute patch job. I have a wedding in an hour." He stood upright, looking her over again, not in a rude way, more like someone trying to figure out if she was joking. Then, quietly, "You don't look like you want to be there." The words hit her like an open palm, not because they were offensive, but because they were true. She didn't respond. She just looked at him, and for the first time that day, she felt seen. The silence between them stretched, tight as a violin string. Charlotte looked away first, pretending to study the road, the trees, anything but the man who had just spoken the one sentence no one else had dared to. Everyone else only saw the dress, the guest list, the venue. No one had looked at her long enough to see the doubt buried beneath the mascara and lace. Until now. He didn't press her for an answer. He just wiped his hands on the rag again and gestured toward the garage. "It's warmer inside. I can get started while you wait." She hesitated. One foot still pointed toward the car, toward the life that was waiting for her to return to the path she'd been handed. But something inside her cracked. She followed him. The garage smelled like motor oil and steel, but it was clean, surprisingly so. Tools were lined up neatly on pegboards, and a small space in the corner had an old couch, a mini fridge, and a worn wooden table with two mismatched chairs. A coffee pot sat on a hot plate, half full, probably hours old. He walked over, poured a cup without asking, and set it gently on the table near her. "I'm Mateo," he said simply. "Charlotte." He nodded and grabbed a flashlight from the workbench, heading back out without another word. She sat, wrapping her fingers around the mug, the warmth seeping into her hands like it was trying to remind her she still had a pulse. Her phone buzzed in her purse again and again. She didn't look. The ringtone was her fiancé's custom tone, the same man who, just last night, had said, "We don't need love to make this work. We need stability." She remembered freezing when he said it, smiling through it, brushing it off like a stray hair on a silk dress. But now, sitting in this old garage, the sound of real tools against real metal in the background. She wasn't sure what was more terrifying, missing her wedding or going through with it. She looked toward the open bay where Mateo's silhouette moved in and out of the light. He didn't know her, had no reason to care, but he'd looked at her with more honesty in 5 minutes than her fiancé had in 5 months. And for the first time that day, she didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a person again. The old clock on the garage wall ticked louder than it had any right to. Charlotte sat with the coffee untouched, her gown pooling around her like a silk storm cloud. Outside, the sound of Mateo's tools clicking against the engine echoed through the air, sharp, purposeful, honest. It was the only thing grounding her, the only thing that didn't feel rehearsed. She finally reached into her purse just to silence the buzzing. 32 missed calls, 6 voicemails. Her mother's number blinked at her like a threat. The last message was from Victor, her fiancé. She pressed play before she could talk herself out of it. "Charlotte, this is insane. Where are you? We have guests arriving. My parents are already asking questions. This is not the time for one of your episodes. Call me. Now." She exhaled through her nose and set the phone down without deleting the message. Her throat tightened. The word stuck with her. Episode. Like her fear was a flaw. Like her gut instinct was a malfunction. Victor had a way of dressing up control and politeness, like gift wrap over handcuffs. Mateo stepped back inside, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. A smudge of oil crossed his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it. "Got the cracked line off. It's worse than I thought, but I've got something that'll hold. Might take an hour, maybe 2. She nodded, her voice thin. "Thank you." He looked at her carefully, the way someone looks at a person trying too hard to seem composed. Then, almost gently, "That guy, the one waiting for you, does he love you?" She blinked. "He says he does." Mateo raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. He walked to the fridge and pulled out a bottle of water, offered it to her. She took it with trembling hands. "And do you love him?" he asked, the question falling between them like an open wound. Charlotte didn't answer right away. Her eyes found the floor, then the wall, Then the cracked window that looked out over the fields. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. "I don't know," she whispered. Matteo nodded as if he already knew, and that terrified her more than anything else. Rain started tapping on the tin roof, soft at first, like a warning. Charlotte pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it didn't help much. The garage wasn't freezing, but the cold wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was settling in her chest. The kind that wraps around your ribs when you realize you've built your life around someone else's idea of happiness. Matteo crouched beside the workbench, fiddling with a corroded clamp, but his eyes flicked to her every few moments. He wasn't nosy, but he wasn't indifferent either. That's what made her stay. If he had been too curious or too cold, she would have walked back into the storm and taken her chances. But he was balanced, quiet, steady, like a wall that wouldn't cave, even if you leaned your whole weight against it. "You're sure you want to get back in that dress and go through with it?" he asked finally, voice low. Charlotte stiffened. "It's not that simple." "I didn't say it was," Matteo replied, not looking up. "Just asked if it's what you want." She stared at him. No one had asked her that, not her mother, not Victor, not even herself. She had let the fittings and the florists and the guest list sweep her away like a river with no current to fight back against. She had said yes to everything because saying no felt like war. "I don't know what I want," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He finally stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's fair. But knowing what you don't want is a start." She looked at him, her eyes rimmed red. "You talk like someone who's had to make that kind of choice." Matteo gave a dry smile. "I made mine a long time ago. Stayed here to take care of my old man instead of leaving for a fancy job out west. Everyone said I'd regret it. Maybe I do, sometimes, but I'd regret it more if I hadn't." Charlotte studied his face. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that don't come from age, but from decisions that carry weight. She thought about her wedding dress hanging in the back seat of her car, about Victor's voice, sharp and cold, about how she hadn't smiled without effort in months. "I think I know what I don't want," she whispered. Matteo didn't nod, didn't grin. He just met her eyes and said, "Good." And for the first time, the rain didn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounded like a beginning. Charlotte stood near the open garage door, watching the rain blur the world outside. The trees, the gravel road, even her car, everything looked smudged, like someone had wiped their hand across a canvas that wasn't dry. She wasn't sure how long she'd been standing there, but time had stopped moving the second she said the words out loud. "I think I know what I don't want." It was the kind of sentence that couldn't be unsaid, the kind that echoed longer than expected. It was terrifying. Behind her, Matteo moved with the quiet rhythm of someone used to working alone. He didn't fill the silence. He respected it. That made it worse somehow because it gave her room to think. And when she thought too much, everything began to unravel. Her phone rang again. She didn't move. It rang a second time. Still, she stayed frozen. On the third ring, Matteo stepped away from the engine and looked at her. "You gonna get that?" She shook her head slowly. "If it's important, they'll call again." Matteo wiped his hands on the edge of a cloth, but didn't press. He just leaned against the doorframe beside her and looked out into the storm. "They're probably freaking out by now," she muttered, voice bitter with guilt. "The guests. My mother. Him." Matteo glanced at her, but stayed quiet. "They all think I'm having a meltdown or something, that I'm being dramatic, selfish, flaky." Her words came faster now, sharp and defensive, even though no one had accused her. Not yet. "But none of them ever asked if I was happy, not once." "You don't sound selfish to me," he said simply. She laughed bitterly. "You don't even know me." Matteo didn't look away. "I know you're standing here in a wedding dress, and you look more like someone who's running away than someone who's late." Charlotte turned toward him, caught in the weight of that truth. She searched his face, half hoping he'd smirk or downplay it, but he didn't. He just looked at her the way people should look at someone who's breaking, like he wasn't scared of the mess. "I'm not sure I can go back," she whispered. Mateo's reply came without hesitation. "Then don't." The words sat in the air like thunder that hadn't struck yet. Then don't. They weren't a challenge, they weren't a dare. They were permission. The kind Charlotte hadn't realized she'd been waiting her entire life to hear. She looked back out at the road, rain still falling in silver sheets, turning the gravel into mud and making everything ahead look distorted, but her path had been blurry long before the storm. Every choice leading up to this day had been paved by someone else's expectations, her mother's carefully curated life plan, Victor's vision of a wife who fit into his world like a decorative vase, beautiful, silent, and easily replaced. "I don't even have a plan," she said softly, her voice unsteady. "I've spent so long doing what other people wanted. I don't know what comes next." Mateo stayed where he was, steady as a stone. Then, "Maybe it's time you figure it out on your terms." She scoffed under her breath, not because she didn't believe him, but because it sounded so impossibly far from where she was. "And what? Just disappear? Leave him at the altar? Let everyone think I've lost my mind?" Mateo turned to face her fully now. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet strength, the kind forged in years of quiet sacrifice. Maybe losing your mind isn't the worst thing if you find your heart in the process. Charlotte bit her lip to stop it from trembling. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, like she was a person, not a role to be played or a prize to be claimed. She felt naked in a way the silk dress couldn't hide, exposed but not embarrassed, just human. Her phone buzzed again on the table. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. She already knew what the messages would say. "Where are you? You're embarrassing us. You owe us an explanation." But for once, she didn't owe anyone anything. She looked at Mateo. "I think I need air," she said. He nodded. "Come on. I know a place." And just like that, without grabbing her veil or her phone or her fear, Charlotte stepped into the rain, not toward her wedding, toward something real. The rain had softened to a quiet drizzle, the kind that made everything shimmer but didn't demand attention. Mateo walked a step ahead, his boots crunching through the gravel, while Charlotte trailed behind, the hem of her dress soaked and dragging like a ghost she couldn't quite shake off. She didn't ask where they were going. For once, she didn't need a destination to feel like she was moving forward. They turned down a narrow dirt path behind the garage, lined with trees that bowed under the weight of the weather. It felt like a hidden world, untouched by the expectations she'd spent her life trying to outrun. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was steady. Mateo didn't fill it with noise, and she didn't feel the pressure to explain herself. After a few minutes, they reached it. A clearing, open and wide, bordered by tall grass and framed by the fading gray of the sky. In the middle stood an old wooden bench worn by weather and time. Mateo nodded toward it. "My dad built this place, said everyone needs a spot where the world doesn't follow." Charlotte sat, slowly, careful of her dress, but no longer caring as much as she had an hour ago. The bench creaked beneath her, but held, like everything in this town, old, weathered, but dependable. He didn't sit beside her, not yet. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching her, like he could see something shifting behind her eyes. "I was 18 when I almost left," he said, voice low. "Had a job offer in Phoenix, better money, brighter future. But my mom had passed and my dad, he wasn't the same. So I stayed. Told myself I'd just be here a year, maybe 2. Charlotte glanced up at him, studying the lines in his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now I fix cars and build things that don't always last, but mean something while they do." She looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "I've never built anything that felt like it was mine." He stepped forward, finally sitting next to her. Not too close, just enough. Then maybe it's time you do." She didn't cry. Not then. But something inside her finally gave up trying to hold the weight alone, and in the stillness of that clearing where no one was watching, Charlotte exhaled for the first time all day. By the time they walked back to the garage, the sky had cracked open just enough to let in streaks of silver light. Charlotte's once pristine dress was now damp, streaked with dirt at the edges. Her hair had curled slightly from the rain, strands falling loose from the carefully pinned style that had taken hours to perfect. She looked less like a bride and more like a woman who had just survived something, and maybe she had. Inside the garage, the warm hum of the space welcomed her again like an old song. Matteo knelt beside the car, tools spread out around him, but his eyes flicked toward her as she entered. She didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to ask. She sat on the same stool as before, fingers tracing the rim of the coffee mug, now cold and forgotten. Her phone sat face down on the table, silent for the first time in over an hour. The stillness was eerie, but freeing. He worked for a while in silence, the sounds of metal against metal, rhythmic and grounding. Then, without looking up, he said, "You can still go back, you know. I can have the car ready in 20 minutes, maybe less." Charlotte looked at the car, then at her reflection in the dusty window across the room. What stared back at her wasn't the polished, composed bride people expected. It was someone stripped down to the bone, unsure, imperfect, and finally honest. "I don't think I want to," she said. Matteo paused, his wrench mid-turn. Slowly, he set it down and stood. "You sure? No one would blame you if you changed your mind." She met his eyes, voice steady now. "I'd blame myself." For a moment neither of them moved. The weight of her decision pressed between them, thick and undeniable. There was no going back, not just to the wedding, but to who she was before today. "I don't know what happens after this," she admitted. Matteo didn't offer promises. He didn't hand her a roadmap or try to paint a picture of a perfect future. He simply walked over, picked up her veil from where it had been tossed aside, and placed it gently on the table like something sacred, but finished. "Then we figure it out from here," he said. And for the first time since she'd put that dress on, Charlotte didn't feel trapped in it. The hum of the fluorescent lights above buzzed softly as the last of the rain dripped from the gutters outside. Charlotte sat with her fingers clasped in her lap, staring at the floor like it might offer her a sign. The silence between her and Matteo wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary, a kind of stillness that allowed truth to breathe. But then her phone lit up again, one buzz, then two, then three in quick succession. Matteo glanced at it but didn't say anything. He was giving her space to decide whether she wanted to go back to that noise, to that life filled with expectation and deadlines disguised as traditions. She didn't move, but this time curiosity gnawed at her. She turned the phone over and opened the messages. Her mother, "People are starting to arrive. We can still salvage this if you hurry." Her planner, "We've delayed the start by 30 minutes. Everyone's being very patient." And Victor, "You're humiliating me. Don't make this worse than it already is. Come back now." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm worried." Not even, "I love you." Just damage control. Charlotte's throat tightened, and her fingers curled around the phone until her knuckles turned white. Matteo must have seen the change in her face because he walked over and crouched beside her, wiping his hands on a cloth as he did. "Bad?" he asked. She nodded, jaw clenched. "It's all about appearances. That's all it's ever been. My mother's worried about the guests. Victor's worried about his image. No one's asking why I left." Matteo looked at her, eyes steady. "Then maybe that's your answer." She didn't cry. She thought she might. But the tears that had threatened to break loose all day dried up, scorched by clarity. She set the phone down gently, screen facing the table, and exhaled like it hurt to do so. "I'm not going," she said. "Not because I want to make a scene, not because I want to hurt anyone, but because if I walk into that church right now, I'm signing up for a life I never chose." Mateo leaned back slightly, watching her, the kind of look that saw more than most people said out loud. "That kind of honesty?" he said. "It's rare." Charlotte smiled faintly, her voice quiet, but certain. "I'm done lying to myself." The knock on the garage door came like a gunshot. Sharp, sudden, demanding. Charlotte's body stiffened before the sound even registered fully in her mind. Mateo looked up from the engine bay, his expression shifting instantly, not to fear, but to alertness. She didn't need to guess who it was. There weren't many people who would think to find her here, but the few who might, they wouldn't knock gently. Another knock, harder this time. Mateo glanced at her. "You want me to get that?" She hesitated. Her heart pounded like it was trying to outrun the moment. "No," she said. "I'll do it." Her heels had long since been discarded in the corner. She padded across the concrete in bare feet, her wedding dress damp and trailing behind her like a forgotten promise. When she reached the door, she paused, her fingers brushing the handle. A deep breath. Then she opened it. Standing there in the gray light was a man in a black suit, tall, well-groomed and soaked from the rain, but not because he cared. His jaw was clenched tight. "Victor." "There you are," he said flatly, his voice a strange mix of relief and barely restrained fury. "What the hell is going on, Charlotte?" She blinked at him, not because she didn't recognize him, but because, for the first time, she was seeing him clearly. Everything about him was polished, perfect, and utterly rigid. He didn't look at her dress. He didn't ask if she was okay. His eyes went straight past her into the garage. "You came here?" he scoffed. "Of all places? You ran from our wedding to this?" Charlotte stepped out, closing the door gently behind her, shielding Mateo from whatever was about to unfold. "I didn't run from the wedding," she said. "I ran from a life I wasn't choosing." Victor's brows shot up. "So now what? You're just not coming back? You're going to throw everything away for, what, a mechanic with a savior complex?" She didn't flinch. Not anymore. "I'm not throwing anything away," she said, voice calm. "I'm reclaiming it." Victor stared at her, incredulous. "And what am I supposed to tell everyone?" Charlotte met his gaze, unwavering. "Tell them the bride finally told the truth." Victor stared at her like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. Maybe he didn't. Maybe that's what scared him. His breath fogged in the cooling air, mixing with the wet scent of pavement and rust. His suit, expensive and tailored, clung to him awkwardly now, drenched and misplaced in the world he had stepped into, a world that didn't care for pretense or polish. "You've lost your mind," he muttered, shaking his head. "This is a phase. You're overwhelmed. I should have known. Your mother said something was off this morning. We can fix this, Charlotte. Just come with me." She almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of how absurd it sounded. Like her unhappiness was a glitch to be repaired, a wrinkle to iron out before guests noticed. Even now, standing in the mess of her decision, Victor was trying to smooth it all over, press it into something digestible, something pretty. "You still think this is about a dress, a venue, or what people might say?" she asked, her voice quieter now, dead calm. "I tried to convince myself I could go through with it. I really did. But today, this storm, this garage, it finally gave me the courage to stop lying." Victor stepped forward, lowering his voice. "He doesn't know you. He doesn't love you. I do." "No," she said sharply. "You love the idea of me, the version that fits into your life, your name, your calendar. You've never once asked me what I wanted. You only told me what we needed." His eyes darkened, jaw clenched. "So what now? You stay here, with him? You think this mechanic can give you a future?" "I don't know," Charlotte replied, stepping back toward the garage door. "But at least he asked me who I am, instead of telling me who I should be." Victor's mouth opened like he had something else to say, some final blow to throw, but nothing came. She turned, hand on the door. "Go home, Victor. The wedding's off." And when she stepped back inside, the garage didn't feel like a place she'd escaped to anymore. It felt like the first place she'd chosen. Matteo didn't ask what happened. He was sitting on the stool near the engine, elbows resting on his knees, rag still dangling from one hand. When Charlotte stepped back into the garage and gently closed the door behind her, he simply looked up, his eyes searching hers for a long second, as if trying to see how deep the wound had gone. She walked past the workbench slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. She didn't cry. Not this time. There was something too solid in her chest now, like the shock had settled into something sharp and certain. Her whole body trembled with adrenaline, but her voice stayed steady when she finally spoke. "He came," she said, barely above a whisper, "tried to talk me into coming back." Matteo watched her for a moment before nodding once, like he expected as much. "You okay?" "I don't know," she admitted, folding her arms across her chest, still trying to warm herself from the inside out. "But I meant it. Every word." He stood, walking over slowly, cautious, like he didn't want to crowd her. "You sure? Because that kind of choice, once it's made, there's no rewinding it." Charlotte met his gaze, her spine straightening. "There's nothing I want to rewind." A gust of wind pushed against the side door, making it rattle. She turned toward the sound instinctively, her nerves still catching up with her conviction. Matteo noticed. "You're not weak for feeling this," he said. "You just walked away from a life people expected you to live. That takes more guts than most." "I didn't feel brave," she whispered. "I felt like I was suffocating." "That's what bravery feels like most of the time," he replied, his voice rough, honest. "Not like victory, more like survival." Charlotte let those words settle. She let herself sit, finally, on the edge of the couch near the old fridge, the veil still crumpled nearby. She looked around at the tools, the open blueprints, the smell of metal and oil, and life, lived without permission. "I don't even know what happens now," she said, more to herself than to him. Matteo knelt beside her again, resting one arm on the table. "Then let's figure it out, one breath at a time." And for the first time all day, she didn't feel like time was running out. She felt like it was finally beginning. The engine of her car roared back to life just as the clouds began to pull apart. Light, bleeding slowly through the sky like something trying to be born. Matteo stepped back from under the hood, wiping the grease from his hands, though a smudge still lingered along his jawline. Charlotte watched from the garage doorway, her bare feet damp from the concrete floor, her dress now a memory of what it had once symbolized. "You're good to go," Matteo said, not looking at her right away. His voice was neutral, even. "It'll hold, at least until you decide where you're headed." She nodded, but didn't move. The moment felt too final, like driving away meant deciding something she wasn't ready to answer. She stepped outside into the cool air that still smelled faintly of rain and metal. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in more ways than just the repair. Matteo gave a small nod. "It's nothing." "No," she replied, stepping closer. "It's not nothing. You gave me space when I needed it, and honesty when I didn't know how to ask for it." His eyes met hers now, steady but cautious, like a man who had learned not to expect anything from anyone. "What happens now, Charlotte?" She swallowed, her fingers brushing the fabric at her side. "That's what I keep asking myself. You've got a car. You've got a choice. There's a world out there that still thinks you're walking down an aisle right now." She looked at him, eyes narrowing with something like grief wrapped in clarity. "Then maybe it's time the world gets used to the fact that I won't live the life they planned for me." Matteo glanced toward the road. "So where will you go?" She hesitated. That question should have filled her with panic, but it didn't. Not anymore. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I'd rather be lost on my own terms than found on someone else's." Matteo let out a quiet breath, a smile tugging faintly at one corner of his mouth. He didn't try to change her mind. He didn't offer to rescue her. He just stood there, real and steady, while she turned to face the road. And for the first time, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like the start of something honest. Charlotte sat behind the wheel, the engine humming beneath her, like a heartbeat she wasn't sure she could trust yet. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, but she didn't shift into drive. The open road lay ahead, slick with rain, stretching into a future that had no map, no aisle, no altar, just her. And the question that had haunted her for years, what would happen if she finally chose herself? Matteo stood a few feet away, wiping his hands on a rag, watching her without pressure. He hadn't asked her to stay, hadn't made promises. That's what unsettled her most. He didn't want anything from her, and maybe that's why she couldn't bring herself to leave. She opened the door and stepped out again, her heels forgotten, her dress dragging through gravel and puddles without hesitation this time. "I don't know where to go," she said, voice raw. "Every road leads back to something I didn't choose." Matteo leaned against the hood, his brow furrowed. "Then don't follow any of them." She looked at him, confused. "What does that mean?" He tossed the rag aside, folding his arms. "You don't need to have it all figured out today. Hell, maybe not even this year. You just called off a wedding, walked out on a life that looked perfect from the outside. Give yourself a minute to breathe." Charlotte stared at him, her breath caught somewhere between fear and understanding. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he said quietly, "but it's worth it." She glanced back at the car, then at the road, then at the man who had never once tried to define her, not even when she showed up wearing the weight of a wedding dress and 1,000 unsaid apologies. "What if I stay a little longer?" she asked. Matteo didn't smile. Not really, just nodded once, slow and steady. "Then I'll make another pot of coffee." She almost laughed. It wasn't grand or romantic, it wasn't dramatic, it was just real. And in a world that had always asked her to be someone else, that felt like the most extraordinary offer she'd ever been given. The coffee was burnt. Not in a terrible way, just strong, old, and slightly bitter, like it had been reheated one too many times. But Charlotte didn't mind. She wrapped her hands around the chipped ceramic mug, like it was something sacred, letting the warmth bleed into her fingers as she sat on the couch near the garage's back wall. Her dress had dried in odd places, clinging to her knees, crumpled and shapeless now. It didn't look like a bridal gown anymore. It looked like cloth, fabric that had survived the storm, same as her. Matteo poured himself a cup too, even though he hadn't touched the last one. He leaned against the workbench across from her, quiet, not watching her, not studying her, just existing in the same space, giving her silence without making it feel like absence. She took a sip and winced. "This is terrible." He smirked. "I never said it was good. I said I'd make it." The tension cracked just slightly between them, the corner of her mouth twitching into the closest thing to a smile she'd managed in hours. But behind it was something else, something lingering. "You think I did the right thing?" she asked, not looking up. Her voice wasn't trembling, but it was uncertain, like the question had come from a place too deep to filter. Matteo didn't answer right away. He set his cup down, crossed the room slowly, and sat on the stool beside her, not close enough to touch, just close enough to hear her breathe. "I think you did the real thing," he said. "And sometimes that's harder than right." She stared into the steam rising from her mug. "It doesn't feel brave. It feels selfish." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You walked away from something that wasn't yours. That's not selfish. That's survival." Charlotte closed her eyes. For so long she had been trained to override herself, to push down instinct in favor of obligation, to smile when she wanted to scream. But today had been different. She looked at Matteo, his hands still stained with oil, his shirt slightly damp from earlier. Nothing about him was polished. And maybe that's why his words stuck. "You don't need to fix me," she whispered. He looked at her, calm and steady. "I wasn't trying to." The afternoon sun began to bleed through the clouds, casting slivers of gold across the floor of the garage. Outside, the last drops of rain clung to the leaves, too stubborn to fall. Charlotte stood near the open bay door, her dress wrinkled and smeared with streaks of mud. Yet for the first time since she'd put it on, She didn't feel like it was suffocating her. It felt like armor she'd shed but hadn't quite let go of yet. Mateo was back at the workbench, sorting through tools he didn't need to sort. His hands moved with purpose, but his eyes kept flicking toward her. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The quiet had grown into something comfortable now. Shared, not awkward. She turned to him, her voice hesitant. "Do you ever wonder what your life could have looked like if you'd taken the job out west?" He looked up slowly. Not startled, just thoughtful. "Every now and then," he admitted. "Mostly when I'm broke or fixing the same broken part for the third time in a week." "Do you regret it?" Mateo shrugged. "Depends on the day. But I don't think I could have looked my dad in the eye if I left him behind. And now, I don't know. Maybe I like knowing I stayed for something that mattered, even if it wasn't easy." Charlotte nodded, her fingers absently tugging at the fabric near her waist. "I spent years trying to convince myself that ease was love, that comfort was happiness. Victor had a plan, a blueprint. I fit in it like a piece of furniture, and I told myself that meant security." Mateo watched her carefully, but didn't interrupt. She continued, quieter now. "But standing in that church, I could already feel myself disappearing." There was a long pause. Mateo walked over and stood beside her, not touching her, just letting their shadows stretch together across the stained floor. "You didn't disappear," he said. "You walked out. That's not the same thing." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her chest loosened, not fixed, not healed, but no longer frozen. "I didn't think anyone would see the difference," she said. Mateo held her gaze, steady and sure. "I did." Charlotte leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest, not because she was cold, but because it gave her something to hold on to. Her gaze drifted across the garage to the small stack of mail on Mateo's counter, to the faded calendar from 2 years ago that no one had bothered to replace. This wasn't a place meant to impress. It was a place built for function, for grit, for honesty. And maybe that's why she was still here. Mateo grabbed a bottle of water from the mini fridge and handed it to her without a word. She took it, their fingers brushing briefly. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic, but it made something in her stomach flip the way no diamond ring ever had. Her phone buzzed again. Mateo's eyes went to it, but he didn't ask. She picked it up, stared at the screen. Her father this time. "I don't care what happened. We'll fix it. But don't embarrass us further." Her hand shook. She placed the phone down gently, like it might explode if she moved too fast. Mateo said nothing, just walked over and pulled a stool up beside her. They sat like that for a moment side by side, saying nothing, letting the storm inside her settle. "They think I owe them an explanation," she said, her voice cracking just enough to reveal the fracture beneath it. "They think I made a scene to punish them, that this was some kind of emotional tantrum." He glanced at her. "Was it?" She shook her head, slow and deliberate. "No, it was the first real decision I've ever made." "That's probably why it scared them," he said. "People don't like it when you stop playing the part they wrote for you." Charlotte laughed, dry and bitter. "And I was always such a good actress." Mateo looked at her then, not through her, not around her, but directly into the parts she'd spent years keeping hidden. "You don't have to perform here," he said. She blinked slowly, as if absorbing the weight of that truth. Then her shoulders dropped for the first time in hours. "I don't think I want to leave," she whispered. "You don't have to," he said back, just as quietly. And in that shared silence, something unspoken between them finally took root. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garage floor. Golden light filtered through the open bay, catching in the curls of Charlotte's damp hair, making her look more like a painting than a woman who had just burned her old life to the ground. Mateo was quiet, seated across from her at the small table where a stack of unpaid bills peeked out from under a newspaper. Neither of them acknowledged them. The weight in the room wasn't about money. Charlotte held her knees to her chest, resting her chin there, Her dress fanned out around her like the last remnant of a role she'd refused to finish playing. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" she asked, her voice low. Not desperate, but raw. Honest. Matteo didn't answer right away. He poured 2 mugs of water and handed one to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "Maybe? Maybe not?" She nodded, as if she already knew. "I guess part of me still wants to be understood. Even after everything, I want them to say, 'We get it. You were right to walk away.'" "They won't," he said, not unkindly. "Because if they admit you were right, they have to admit they were wrong. And people like that, they've built their entire world on pretending they always know best." Charlotte stared down into the mug like it might offer clarity. "Then what am I supposed to do with all this guilt?" "Let it pass through," Matteo said. "Feel it, and then let it go, because if you carry it long enough, it starts to look like a responsibility. And you don't owe anyone a performance just to keep them comfortable." Her eyes lifted to his, glassy but steady. "Why do you always say the right thing?" "I don't," he said. "I just don't care if it's the wrong moment." She let out a shaky breath, half a laugh, half a sob. "God," she whispered, wiping under her eyes, "I haven't felt this alive in years." Matteo leaned back, watching her closely. "That's because for the first time you're not living someone else's life." And she knew in that moment he was right. They heard the crunch of tires before they saw the car. Charlotte froze. Matteo turned his head slowly toward the sound, expression unreadable. A black town car eased down the narrow drive, its headlights cutting through the golden haze of the early evening. The same kind of car she had ridden in for every event her family deemed important. Galas, fundraisers, dinners where her smile was mandatory and her voice was not. It stopped just beyond the gravel, engine idling. The back door opened. Her mother stepped out. Hair perfectly set, heels clean despite the rain, pearls at her throat like armor. She didn't look around. She looked through the place, nose wrinkled at the smell of oil and exhaust. When her eyes landed on Charlotte, she didn't soften. She didn't blink. "I'm not here to argue," she said, voice sharp and polished. "I'm here to bring you home." Charlotte didn't move. Her hands had gone cold again, despite the lingering warmth in the garage. Matteo stood beside her now, not blocking, not stepping in, just present, still. Like a wall she could lean on if she needed to. "This is my home," Charlotte said, the words slow, careful. Her mother's expression didn't falter. "Don't be ridiculous. You've made your point. It's been a long day. You can apologize tomorrow quietly. We'll issue a statement. Victor is willing to be gracious, but only if we act fast." Charlotte stared at her, something in her chest unraveling with each sentence. Not grief, not fear, something colder, recognition. "You think this is about embarrassment," she said. Her mother blinked, a flicker of something, surprise maybe, breaking through. "Of course it is. Do you understand what you've done to our name?" Charlotte stepped forward slowly. "Do you understand what you've done to mine?" The air shifted. The sun dipped further. Her mother's mouth parted, but no words came out. And Charlotte didn't wait for them. She turned her back to the woman who had taught her silence. Walked back inside the garage that had offered her something better. A voice. A choice. And this time, she wasn't giving either of them up. The door clicked shut behind her, muffling the world outside. Charlotte stood with her back to it, breath shallow, fingers still trembling from the confrontation. She could feel the weight of her mother's disapproval like it had been stitched into the fabric of her skin. Years of being molded, muted, molded again. But something had snapped today, clean and final, a quiet breaking that felt strangely like relief. Matteo didn't ask what was said. He didn't need to. He was already pouring water into a kettle, moving with that same steady rhythm that grounded her from the moment she walked into his world. There was no fire in his eyes, no judgment, just that quiet watchfulness that said, "I saw you. I see you still." She crossed the room and leaned against the edge of the table, her body suddenly heavy, like it had taken everything to hold herself upright out there, and only now was she allowed to release the weight. Mateo slid a chair out with his foot, silent invitation. She sank into it. "She didn't come for me," Charlotte said after a beat. "She came for the version of me they can parade around again, the well-behaved puppet who sits straight, smiles on cue, and doesn't ask questions." Mateo set the kettle on the burner and turned toward her, arms folded, eyes steady. "And what did you tell her?" Charlotte looked up at him, something steel-like settling behind her eyes. That she lost that version. A flicker of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not smug, not proud, just knowing, like he understood exactly what it cost to say it. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I think I am." They stayed like that in the soft, humming silence of the garage as the kettle began to steam. Outside, the town car backed out slowly, tires crunching over the gravel like retreating footsteps from a battle no longer worth fighting. For the first time in her life, Charlotte hadn't just stood up to her family. She had stood up for herself. And it didn't make her feel broken. It made her feel whole. The tea was too hot when she took the first sip, but she didn't care. Charlotte let the burn settle on her tongue like a reminder that she was still here, still real, still standing. Mateo sat across from her, his cup untouched, fingers laced together on the table like he was holding back everything he wanted to say. She didn't blame him. This day had stretched longer than either of them expected. It had started with a wedding and ended with a woman stripped bare of her past. Not many people could sit beside that kind of unraveling and not flinch. "I feel like I burned my life down today," she said finally, staring into the steam rising from her mug. Mateo's voice was low. "Sometimes fire's the only way to clear the ground." Charlotte looked up. "And if there's nothing left afterward? Then you build something new, something that's yours this time." The words settled between them like bricks, heavy, permanent. She wanted to believe them, she really did, but she wasn't naive. Just because she'd walked away didn't mean the voices would go quiet. Her mother would call again, Victor would find ways to twist the story, to protect his image. And the world they came from didn't like women who disappeared unless they came back apologizing. She set her mug down. "They'll paint me as unstable, say I cracked under pressure. They'll say Mateo, the mechanic, manipulated me." Mateo didn't flinch at the word. He met her eyes, firm and calm. "Let them talk." Charlotte exhaled through her nose. "You don't care what they think? I care what you think?" The simplicity of it hit harder than any lecture, any threat, any accusation she'd ever received. He didn't want to control the narrative. He wasn't interested in spinning the truth into something more digestible. He just wanted her to believe in herself. Charlotte leaned back in the chair, arms folded, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like years. Maybe she had burned her life down, but in this quiet, flickering space, beside a man who spoke in truths instead of performances, she finally realized she hadn't lost everything. She'd finally begun. The sky was dimming fast now, folding into the quiet gray of evening. Shadows stretched long across the garage floor, and the hum of passing cars on the distant highway began to fade into a low, constant hush. The world felt slower here, less demanding. Charlotte sat on the edge of the couch, absently peeling at the tag on the tea bag like she needed something small to do with her hands. Her wedding dress had dried stiff, wrinkled beyond repair. It clung to her like a relic from a ceremony that never happened. She looked down at herself and laughed, quiet, broken, real. "I should take this off," she said. "It's ridiculous now." Mateo leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, eyes soft. "You don't have to do anything until you're ready." She stood slowly, feeling the weight of the fabric pulling at her, like the dress itself still wanted her to finish what it was made for. She reached for the buttons down the back and froze. "I can't reach," she whispered. Mateo stepped forward, stopping a few feet from her. "Want help?" Charlotte nodded without turning around. He moved closer, hands gentle, slow. His fingers worked through the row of buttons, each one feeling heavier than the last. They weren't just closures, they were chapters. Every one of them a moment. She had agreed to something she didn't want. Every one a step toward a future someone else had drawn. When the last button came undone, Charlotte let the dress slide from her shoulders. She caught it at the waist and held it there, standing in silence as the cool air kissed the bare skin of her back. Mateo didn't move, didn't stare. He just stood behind her like a wall, silent and respectful, grounding her. She turned slowly, holding the dress in her arms like something that no longer belonged to her. "I don't know what happens next," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Mateo met her eyes. "Then let's start with something small." She tilted her head, confused. "Like what?" He smiled just a little. "Dinner." And in that ordinary word, she found something she hadn't expected. Hope. Charlotte sat on the stool at the tiny counter beside the workbench, wearing a pair of Mateo's flannel pajama pants and an old T-shirt he had offered her without saying much. The clothes hung loose on her, but for the first time in days she felt like herself. No corset laced too tight, no heels she had to smile through the pain in, just cotton, warm air, and the smell of something simple and human, grilled cheese on a cast-iron pan. Mateo moved around the makeshift kitchen with a kind of quiet grace, as if he didn't want to disturb whatever fragile thread held this strange, new moment together. She watched him, trying not to think about the chaos she'd left behind only hours ago, the shocked faces, the cold phone calls, the silence that had followed her mother's final look. She tried not to think about the headlines that might be coming, or Victor's anger, or the way she'd driven the knife into every expectation placed on her with a single sentence: "I'm not coming." "What's your story?" she asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Mateo glanced over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "Everyone's got a reason for why they're where they are. You said something about your dad. But why this place? Why stay?" He flipped the sandwich and leaned against the counter. "Because not everything broken needs to be replaced. Some things are worth fixing. And I guess I wanted to believe that about people, too." Charlotte let those words settle into her chest. They hit somewhere she didn't have a name for. "Did someone break you?" she asked softly. He paused, then looked her in the eye. "Yeah, but staying here let me put myself back together one day at a time." The sandwich hit the plate with a soft sizzle. He slid it toward her without ceremony. She took a bite. It was simple, but perfect. "I don't remember the last time I ate something like this," she said with a half-smile. "It's like I've been starving without knowing it." Mateo looked at her, his eyes steady, his voice low. "Maybe you were, just not for food." And she knew exactly what he meant. The garage had gone quiet again, except for the low hum of a portable heater and the occasional creak of the metal roof cooling from the day's heat. Charlotte sat curled up on the couch now, legs tucked beneath her, the remnants of the sandwich gone, the plate balanced on her lap like it might ground her. She didn't realize how tired she was until the adrenaline wore off, and all that was left was a body running on fumes and a heart still catching up to the decision it had made. Mateo sat a few feet away in the chair by the wall. He'd stopped pretending to busy himself. Now he just sat with her, the way someone does when they understand presence is more valuable than words. "You think it's really over?" she asked finally, her voice small. Mateo tilted his head. "The wedding?" She nodded. He looked at her gently. "It was over the second you walked into this garage." Charlotte blinked slowly, eyes tracing the ceiling. "It doesn't feel real yet. I keep expecting someone to show up and drag me back, like this is just a scene in a movie where I get my rebellion and then I go back to being the obedient daughter." He let the silence breathe before replying. "That's the thing about breaking the script. Once you do, you can't pretend it didn't happen." She thought about that for a long time, about all the years she smiled through discomfort, bit her tongue instead of saying what she meant, chose what was expected because it was safer than uncertainty, and now here she was, barefoot, in borrowed clothes, sitting in a garage that smelled like oil and warmth, eating grilled cheese with a man who saw right through her mask from the beginning. "I don't miss him," she whispered, like she wasn't sure if it was wrong to say. Mateo nodded slowly. "Then that's your answer." Charlotte stared down at the plate in her lap, her fingers tracing the chipped edge. "I think I miss who I thought I was supposed to be more than who I left." And that was the grief she hadn't let herself feel yet, not for a man or a wedding, but for a version of herself that never truly existed. The moon had climbed higher now, casting a soft silver glow through the open side door of the garage. It made the oil stains on the floor shimmer, turned the dust in the air into glitter, and painted the contours of Charlotte's face with something close to peace. She lay back on the couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling, like it held the answers she hadn't yet dared to ask. Mateo sat on the floor nearby, back against the wall, his knees bent, one hand lazily rolling a socket wrench across the floor and catching it before it could clatter too far. He hadn't asked her to leave, not once. There was no expiration date on her presence, no ticking clock reminding her this moment was temporary. That was the strangest part of all. He just let her exist. She broke the silence, voice low. "What if they come again? My parents, Victor, someone with a better offer, more money, more guilt." Mateo didn't look at her. He just kept rolling the wrench back and forth, slow and rhythmic. "Then you tell them no again, and again after that, and as many times as it takes until they understand that you get to decide who you are." She closed her eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep doing that." "You are," he said. "You already did the hardest part." Her throat tightened. "That's the thing. I thought walking away would feel like the end of something, but it feels like the beginning, and beginnings are terrifying." "Yeah," he said softly, "but they're also honest." She turned her head toward him. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers in the dark. "Because someone should have been, a long time ago." Charlotte swallowed hard. The ache in her chest wasn't pain, it was space. Something inside her making room for truth, for air, for something that didn't require her to perform to be loved. She whispered, "I don't want to go back." And Mateo nodded like he'd known that all along. "Then don't." The wrench stopped rolling, and the silence between them said more than either of them could. The sound of birds was the first thing she noticed when she woke up, sharp and startling in the stillness, as if the world had decided to carry on without asking for permission. Morning light poured through the garage windows, warm and golden, touching everything with a softness that made the night before feel distant, almost dreamlike. Charlotte sat up slowly, the borrowed blanket sliding off her shoulders. Her neck ached from the angle she'd slept in, but she didn't care. The ache was proof she'd rested in a place that hadn't expected her to perform. The couch cushions were old, the air smelled faintly of grease and pine, and her hair was tangled, but she felt more whole than she had in years. Mateo was already awake. She spotted him outside through the open garage door, crouched next to a rusted-out pickup, sunlight streaking across his back. He hadn't changed much, still in yesterday's flannel, sleeves rolled, hands working without hurry. There was no theater in the way he moved, no urgency to impress. He just did what needed doing. Charlotte watched him for a long moment before stepping outside, barefoot again, the concrete cool beneath her feet. He looked up as she approached, eyes squinting slightly against the light. "Morning," he said. She offered a soft smile. "You let me sleep." "You needed it." They stood in silence for a beat, the sound of wind rustling through the trees filling the space between them. It wasn't awkward. It was real. "I should probably figure out what comes next," she said, voice quiet. Mateo nodded. "You don't have to figure it all out today." Charlotte looked at the field beyond the garage, the open sky, the dirt under her feet. Everything ahead of her was unknown, But unlike yesterday, that uncertainty didn't feel like a cliff. It felt like a door. "I think I want to stay," she said suddenly. "Not forever, just long enough to remember who I am." Mateo didn't ask for promises. He didn't need to. He just said, "There's space here for whatever you need." And for the first time she believed it, not just in him, but in herself. Later that afternoon the sun hung low behind the clouds, casting a golden softness over the small clearing behind the garage. Mateo had taken her back there, to the place with the bench his father had built, the one surrounded by wildflowers and silence, a pocket of the world untouched by obligation. Charlotte stood barefoot in the grass, arms crossed over her chest, hair tangled by the wind, heart steadier than it had been in years. The wedding dress was gone now, folded carefully into the trunk of her car like something that no longer belonged to her. In its place, she wore a simple sundress Mateo had found in a box of his sister's old clothes. It wasn't tailored, it wasn't designer, but it fit, and more importantly, it felt like hers. Mateo sat on the bench, a small wooden box balanced on his knee. His hands were dirty from the morning's repairs, grease still under his nails. He didn't clean up for her, and she didn't expect him to. He was exactly who he'd been since the moment she met him, steady, honest, quietly brave. She walked toward him slowly. "What's that?" He looked up, almost shy. "Something I made. It's not much." He opened the box, and inside was a delicate metal pendant, a gear polished and etched with a tiny compass rose in the center. It hung from a leather cord, simple, strong, beautiful. Charlotte stared at it, emotion rising in her throat. "You made this?" He nodded. "Didn't know why at the time, just something I kept working on in between jobs. I guess I was waiting for the right person to give it to." She took it carefully, like it might break, but it didn't. It was weighty in her hand, real. She looked at him then, eyes shimmering in the light. "Thank you," she whispered. Mateo stood, brushing his palms on his jeans. No vows, no ceremony, just this, something honest. Charlotte stepped into him, resting her forehead against his. "No altar," she murmured. "No lies." He smiled, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was running from something. She was finally walking toward it.